Get started. Some of you may know we cannot webcast today because of the conference taking up all our bandwidth, many different types of bandwidth next door. But we are recording it, and that tape will be posted, so you can listen to it at 2 in the morning instead of watching at 2 in the morning.
That would definitely be a sleeper.
Okay, so that, I'm not sure Wayne is going to join us. I think he's probably at the conference, but if he does, he can join us later, but we'll just get started. First item on the agenda is the board agenda, and we'll start as usual with the public hearing, page 10, item 32. This is 1168. We've been to committee a couple times. In a rule like this that affects a variety of products and different, dozens of manufacturers, there's always going to be some issues, but I think we've done a really good job of what once was a whole host of issues, it's only down to one or two issues, and I don't think they're that major. So we've made some changes to the board resolution and made some clarifications on the methods. And some definition clarifications. We heard at stationary committee about the availability of lower VOC PVC welding. We were able to confirm that there are products available on the shelf and that meet this lower limit. Even despite that, we're giving everyone plenty of time for those that don't meet to reformulate with the tech assessment. So we think we've resolved most of it. It's not that we probably will get some testimony on some very specific issues. I have staff here if want to ask any questions or go into detail on 1168.
Any changes since stationary centers?
Mostly to the resolution that clarifies a couple of the method issues. One issue was the language, kind of says if you failed, you can interpret it to mean if you fail this test or that test, you're held accountable for both. So but that's not the real intent. The intent is any given product will have one test method. It's just until you see the product, you can't decide which method is going to be more appropriate. So we're committing to a guidance document that will very specifically say if you have this type of product, it is this test method. That'll be the method that is used for labeling and enforcement.
I'm sure Rita will be happy.
That's partly her issue, but then she has another issue. We also have resolution language on her method, 7767, and that we'll be reviewing the formulation data, all the issues that came up there. So we have a resolution language on that as well. And the staff report goes into much more detail on these issues.
Great, thanks.
Anything else you guys want to add?
It's also in the rule, right?
And in the rule, we did add this guidance document is now actually within the rule. The executive officer will develop this guidance document to determine which test method will be used when 2 or more applicable test methods could be used. I think that should resolve that issue. Any other questions on that? Okay. It's the only public hearing. If you go back to page 2 of the agenda. There are the minutes, not available yet, if you have questions. There's 2 set hearings. The first one is 415, which is the orders from the rendering facilities. We're on track for that.
Do we have a cost in regard to what the cost is?
We had some preliminary cost estimates from, when rulemaking was suspended before, but we are just updating those. We're very close to it.
What is the range?
Depends who you ask. Our estimates are, and the rate, it depends on the facility. There's essentially 4 facilities the rules will apply to. One is essentially compliant. They've already made investments. Darling. There is Farmer John, which probably will have some compliance costs, but probably less than a few $100,000 maybe, but probably even less. We had a good meeting with them yesterday. The 2 facilities that will probably have more compliance costs are Baker Commodities and then D&D. D&D is a small.
Which are the ones to the east? Is that
D&D and Baker.
Because I look at your windrows, which was in the staff report, and it would appear that most of the odors, it's probably southwest, which would be the ones on the west that would be causing it, because to the east, that southwest goes off away from the critical areas. My other point is that I don't believe that any one of these have been issued a notice of violation for public nuisance.
One has.
Oh, one has. And yet I look at, so I figured that the cost is maybe several $1 million or more. But Sunshine, Golf up in,
Sunshine Canyon.
they had 130 notices of violations. They had to pay $1 million something. And these folks who have had no notices of violations are going to be faced with millions of dollars to comply with something.
Ron, doesn't that highlight, though, the need for the rule?
No,
Because you've got multiple facilities
it would
there.
highlight to me the need for our inspectors to be out there at night and to be, I don't know if they, does anyone know if we had inspectors out in that area during the swings and mids?
Doing the what?
Well,
Swings from midnight.
swings and mids, in shifts. We used to do that.
Well, we've had them out in the past. Number one, you need a certain number of complaints for a violation, and this community, for whatever reason, does not call in a lot of complaints. But if you ask them, do you get these odors frequently? The answer is yes. And staff has been out there frequently and gets the odors, not just on Bandini, but in the community.
This is
Ron, I take my interns out there every summer, give them an EG tour, and the last 2 summers, when the interns get off, they almost throw up. It's pretty rancid. When you go to Boyle Heights, you can still smell it. They're not as bad as it is right outside, but you can still smell it in the community. So there is odors out there.
So NOVs isn't the best measure of whether you have a problem or an environmental justice problem, especially in a case where it's hard to get the right number of complaints, and because of the cluster of facilities and the distance to the community, it's hard to track it back to an individual source. But we're asking for some very basic things in the rule, and we're working with the facilities to make sure it's workable and affordable for all the facilities. Any other questions on 415?
Well, Baker just essentially says you're going to drive us out of business. So has there been any movement with showing them that potentially that's not the case?
It's hard to make their business
entrenched.
decisions for them or figure out what's going into their business decisions. I think their estimate of what it would cost them was much higher than what we think it should cost them. And we had a good meeting with them yesterday. And when you go through the provisions of the rule one by one and talk to them about what they think they have to do versus our intent, then the costs just start coming down and down and down and down.
Okay.
So we're going to make some changes based on our meeting yesterday, some clarifications or some areas that we're not that worried about at the facility that we're getting caught up into the rule that may not need to be. So we're really trying to minimize those costs.
Okay.
So I think at the beginning they came out and said this was going to be like $27 million.
I can't remember the number, but it was
Oh,
very
huge.
Yeah. Our estimate was about $3 million. But of that 27, for instance, $8 million was to repave their entire property. And the rule never said you had to repave your entire property. It said you had to repair some potholes in like one area if they exist, and they don't even exist. So that cost isn't there. So as we go through it, we think the costs are getting down to a reasonable level that wouldn't necessarily put them out of business.
So you're clarifying the difference between what you think you have to do and what the rule says.
Yeah.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Is there, we've been talking specifically about the rendering facilities, but is this inclusive of, or is there an increased scrutiny of the supply chain? The feed stock, if you will, into those?
There are some requirements for covering of trucks, right?
Right.
But that's about all we're doing on that side. But when we first started this a couple years ago, we also had a companion rule for 16, which was going to deal with some of the issues we were having at the grease rendering facilities. We'll get back to that eventually, but right now we're just focusing on the large rendering
What
plants.
brings up the thing is that most of the complaints were grouped around the 101 freeway, which I think goes along with maybe what Mark's thoughts, that perhaps a lot of those orders were in the transport of the animals.
It's pretty clear when you're at the rendering plants and even when you're in the community that it's coming from one of the plants when you're getting that smoke. I mean, it's hard to document all that all the time, but when you're there, there's really no doubt. I know that you can come up with arguments one way or the other, but if you spend any time there, it's pretty clear.
No, the reason I ask is because I had recently contact with a business who's in the supply chain business.
Yeah.
On the east side, and where he said he's had increased enforcement.
So a lot of the materials, depends on the facility, they're refrigerated or frozen for transport. Eventually that wears off at some point along the supply chain, but a lot of it does come into the facilities and it's cold or refrigerated or was recently frozen. And some of the problems we see are, when they get backed up and there's several trucks there in the receiving area that's not enclosed except for one facility. So that receiving area is not enclosed. You essentially have carcasses out in the sun on a hot summer day on the pavement for what could be many, many hours.
Is it a best practice typically then we require, again, with those, like in trucking in the carcasses?
Best practice to have it covered?
Yeah, or to be refrigerated, or to try to.
Yeah, if you talk to them, it's very hard to control. There's different supply chains, so they send out their own trucks, and they have to pick stuff up, and they can't necessarily control whether the facilities are going to have their own refrigeration capabilities or freezing capabilities. But they also have big contracts that bring in a set supply, and they have some more control over that under those contracts. But we didn't go really too far beyond kind of the property line in terms of the supply chain.
Is there like some time limits for?
Well, there are time limits if before the enclosure is required. If it comes in refrigerated, the holding time before it goes into the receiving pit to go through the process can be longer than if the material that comes in is not refrigerated. So we do take accommodation for that. And then we also have, even afterwards, for the operations that have batch type cookers, where it's not a continuous system, we have timelines for pushing material in, keeping it covered otherwise, so that the material does not sit out. And it behooves them not to have the material sit out because they want a good end product. So we I think we do a pretty good accommodating those timelines.
Yeah, because doesn't at some point become a health risk if you have?
Exactly, yeah. And they won't do it if they,
Right.
I mean, they can't do anything with material. They can't
Right.
sell it, their end product, if it gets to that point.
Because the supply chain has that issue too. You have a
they
certain
want-
time
they want
limit to
to
get
move
that product to
Except for the case
market.
of D&D,
essentially.
which takes the euthanized animals. They do get all their stuff refrigerated, so when it comes in, it is refrigerated. And of course, all that material is either fertilizer or shipped off out of the country. They can't use it in the country. So, but for the other plants, they need to get it through.
Sure. Okay.
I'm excited about the tours.
We're going back today. We're going back to two.
It'll be a warm day too.
I'll
Just eat before you go.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
That's not.
You guys are going out this afternoon, right? We're going on another visit this afternoon. Not me. Okay, anything else on 415? 1420, Susan, you want to give a?
So, Rule 1420 is the third in the series of the lead rules. We have 1420.1, which was the large lead acid battery recycling facilities, then 1420.2, which was the sources that were over 100 tons, processing more than 100 tons. Requirements for Rule 1420, it does have the same ambient requirement, but the monitors, it's an on-ramp for facilities that are either we monitor and we find that they're non-compliant with the ambient standard, and they're going to have to start monitoring. The second trigger is if they have 2 failed source tests within a 36-month period. The rule requires building enclosure. There's no requirement for total enclosures with negative air to pollution controls. The rule requires that they do periodic source testing, tightens up the point source emission standard, allows them to test not only on efficiency, but they can do an outlet test, which is provides a cost savings for them in terms of their source test. Instead of testing an inlet and outlet, they're only testing the outlet. And has housekeeping requirements similar to 1420.1 and .2, but less frequently because of the smaller facilities. And I think that, generally is the key requirements of the rule. So, had a working group meeting a week ago. We had some general comments and some specific recommendations for providing additional clarifications and consistency with Rule 1420.1 and 2 in terms of some of the other provisions in there. So I think we're on a good path to bring the rules to the board in October, or November, November.
You reference ambient air quality. What do you mean by that? Exactly. Are you talking about the air monitors that we have, the established air monitors, and their readings?
No, if we place a monitor, an air monitor, near the facility and they're above the 0.150 micrograms per cubic meter, then the facility, that is
Right.
one of the trigger points.
So you consider that ambient. If it's a fence line, would you consider that an ambient monitor?
Yes.
Yes.
That's how EPA considers ambient.
Do you know if there are any readings close to facilities that are at that level?
Right now, in terms of these facilities, no, we don't. We don't have any monitors near these facilities. We know on the 1420.1 facilities for Exide and Cometco, they had levels that were above the 0.15.
When they were putting out 500 to 1,000 tons, a pound rather, per year.
Right, but if you look at the point source requirement, same point source requirement, even though you can have a facility that's processing less lead, if their emissions are not well controlled, you can still have an issue on the ambient.
In 1994, since 1994, we have been at, for our ambient, our 9 or 10 stations, we've been at 0.15 or below since 1994.
Much lower.
Much
now.
lower.
Much lower now, 0.01.
Since 2000, we're down to 0.01 or lower. So for the general population, we're in great shape. We're talking 93 to 97% below the federal standard. And I don't really hate doing this, but I would just reference that in 2012, Exide put out something like 500 pounds of lead. And there's this lovely report, which I have here somewhere. I can't find it now. But it referenced the impact of lead on Boyle Heights during that period. And the writer, might have been you, Phil, referenced that it was at 90% below the federal standard at that time. With Cometco, 2 miles down, putting out 500 pounds during the entire year. So I think we have and I might add that the high reading we had in 2016 for fence line was 0.06 parts per million. So we are well below, and that's next to the major facilities.
After we passed rules and controlled those facilities, so
But Cometco was putting out 25 pounds last year, which is.
well, remember that what gets reported in AER, especially in the past years, was just what was coming out of their stack. And the discovery, largely at Exide, was that that wasn't the sum total of their emissions because it's fugitive emissions.
Right.
So these ambient monitors are the ultimate way to tell whether there's some total of emissions, fugitive and point source, no matter what they are not causing an exceedance of a federal standard or our standards and our rules. So we don't know. There's no requirement to monitor in this rule. It's just if we happen to monitor and find something, they need to be held to the same standard that any other facility would be.
But Susan was nice enough to send me the list of companies, and I ran it, and of course, I have lots of time on my hands, so I can do this. So I ran it against the class system, and I found that we had 2 facilities out of 19 facilities that were in the class system reporting emissions that were basically 1.3 pounds. All the rest, the few others that reported emissions were like 0.06 or 0.01, and a lot of them are print circuit boards. And I decided to go to a local facility on that list, and I talked to them and said, well, lead? No. Well, I guess we use some in soldering. But in other words, this list,
And the rule recognizes the smaller users are folks that are using lead at very low temperatures. And they're not subject to the same rigor of the requirements in regard to
Right.
still the conditional ambient monitoring if we do find an issue near the facility. They're subject to the housekeeping requirements, record keeping requirements, but they're not subject to the point source requirements of the rule. So there's different requirements based on different.
but is there a
users.
minimum, for instance,
And just to clarify, that was through a public records request, and so, yeah, I just wanted to clarify, so if anybody, requests this information,
well, I
We
just
just asked everyone to go through the
asked
same,
for
yeah.
the list. I mean,
But-
it was
but
a
I
public
do wanna-
record request.
I do want to mention again that those are reported emissions, and we know, not just for lead, but for hexchrome and nickel and other things that we have found recently, that those might not reflect the total impact because of the fugitive emission issue. So that is why ambient monitoring or.
But I would
ambient
well,
monitoring-
this company, which was in San Dimas, where I live, and said that they had such a clean operation that the LA County said, no, you don't have to report your wastewater anymore because you have so little. And I would imagine in a closed facility, you will have very little fugitive going out of the, that's what I'm gonna
Well,
say.
if they're closed, then it might be compliant with a lot of our requirements.
But I think you're gonna have far less than 107, 108, I don't remember the number, that will be falling under this rule. And the largest one was one foundry reported, and it has a couple foundries that reported nothing. And I went through the entire, from 2000 all the way up in regard to emissions. And they did not report, they reported stuff, but not lead. So I'm just saying that. I had time to do that, but maybe staff could have had time to do that early on
Staff
too.
did that.
Right,
What's the
Yeah, did you have the
idea?
same findings?
it's over 2 tons process.
Over 2 tons processed.
So some of those facilities, even though they didn't report lead emissions, we've gone out to the facility and looked at what they are processing. And so we've identified facilities that even though they're not reporting through AER on their lead emissions, they were showing us the breakdown of the percentage of lead and other metals that they're processing. So we know those facilities would be subject to the rule. So just looking at AER is not the only way to determine the applicability into the rule.
And there is a threshold, 2 tons of lead processed.
Right, and greater than 0.5% lead in the metal.
Is there any opposition to the rule?
Well, if I said no, then I'm sure that somebody's gonna oppose the rule. But in terms of the stakeholder participation, we've had not a lot of stakeholder participation through the process. And then the comments have been very constructive. We've been able to work through, most of the comments. They, on this 0.05%, they're asking for different ways to determine the 0.05%. We're able to incorporate that. They're looking at, for example, on the off-ramp, they want consistency with 1420.2. If they had to do monitoring, they want the same off-ramp that's allowed in 1420.2. So many of the things that are being brought up, we're able to incorporate. So what we're identifying as, key remaining issues, we don't see any key remaining issues that we're aware of.
Okay, this is the one that the first working group was, shall I say, particularly raucous.
No, this one has been particularly calm through the whole
Okay.
rulemaking. And probably the most comments we received was at the public workshop about 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Okay.
Yeah, and there are very specific comments on specific language, and that we addressed that in the last working group meeting.
Okay, great, thanks.
Just one thing to add. So, as you probably know, because of Exide, LA County was put in non-attainment for lead many years ago. The numbers now show we are in attainment, but EPA hasn't made that official redesignation yet. we want to submit that redesignation request. This rule, there's a commitment in the SIP that we submitted to them to come back to this rule, because currently this rule has a 1.5 limit on it, which is, so this will, once we get this done, we'll be working towards getting that redesignation.
And while we throw Exide and Cameco into the same bucket because they're both big projects, isn't there pretty significant differences between our experience with them?
And that's why we split the rule. So Rule 1420 used to encompass all the lead sources. So we peeled off first the Exide and Cameco, then we took the battery manufacturers and then other large processors of lead, and then this is the remaining. So 1420 is now sort of the smaller sources. And just to follow up, Mark, the more contentious meeting, the first meeting was Rule 1407, probably is what you're thinking of, and that was a little more recent. 1407 will be sort of the companion for the non-lead, and it was quite contentious.
Yep. My query was more that between Cameco and Exide, my understanding is that there's still a pretty big variance between the level of compliance and violations.
One is not operating, the other is. That's one big difference.
Well,
I'm curious about one thing. Why does Exxon have 5 pounds of lead coming out from 2016? Because I thought they were out of operation. They're done. Why would they? They report.
I don't know how they calculated that.
That's-
Maybe they're
they
doing a
reported it,
fugitive calculation for, the cleanup. I don't know exactly. We could check into that.
They do have a lead oxide paste facility, so I'm not sure if that's possibly what you're.
No, it's the Vernon. It's the Vernon. Is it in Vernon?
It's near Vernon.
No, this was Vernon.
But to your point, yeah, when we were going through 1420.1 a few years ago, there was a difference in the way that those two facilities were operated when they were both operating. Okay, any other questions on 1420? All right, the bottom of page 3, item 3, Matt?
Yeah, so the next set of items are all of STAs. So the first one, item 3, is to execute contracts to essentially receive money from the Energy Commission. Back in, I think it was 2015, we applied with 2 companies to do system improvements to the building, energy efficiency and energy storage projects. We won those 2 grants from the Energy Commission, totaling about $7.2 million. And so the 2 companies are Wilden and AMS. They're going to do upgrades to our building efficiency with variable speed chillers, DC lighting, a variety of different advanced technologies. And then AMS, Advanced Microgrid System, is going to be installing renewable energy solar panels as well as energy storage with some Tesla batteries. So all of that will be applied to the building. We are putting in some cost share because there were set aside monies to do some of those upgrades. And then we'll be also receiving SGIP money, which is self-generation incentive funding, and those funds will be applied as part of a payment to the AMS, the Advanced Microgrid System.
Is that going forever?
It's a 20-year contract with them.
There'll be cost savings
Cost savings far outweigh the cost that we're paying.
in terms of energy costs.
This grant just recently awarded, recently decided? Was this grant recently?
Back in, I think it was,
January, February.
yeah, earlier this year, we were notified.
So we had a turbine vendor. Apparently there's a new 15 kilowatt turbine out there, which is pretty big. And that they asked us to participate, but it was like a week before the grant was due. And we're the government, we move very slowly, so without our facilities folks to find an appropriate location where the turbines might make sense. I'm not sure if it's the same grant, but it sounds similar. It's for
It may have been the same.
free
It may have been the same.
stuff that's not
proposal.
quite on the market yet.
Same solicitation. by the Energy Commission.
How long will it take for the building to be upgraded on there, for doing that, if you're doing building upgrades?
It's probably gonna take a year or 2 years. These are 2 really large projects.
Right.
So.
Do you have an estimate of cost savings?
We anticipate that it's 182,000 utility savings per year, of which part of that goes to the company as a payment.
That's just for the
That's just for
AMS.
that's just for energy storage, for the energy efficiency.
20% of our utility bill right now, so 200,000 a year.
Thank you.
So together, it's close to 400,000.
So 2 million will get paid back in 5 or 6 years.
Wow, that's
But
great.
you know, that's like an additional 2 or 3 million going to the company over that 20-year period, right?
Yes.
That's a lot of money.
As Phil just mentioned, we paid
they-
it back in a short amount.
Did they ever identify their costs that wasn't covered by the, I mean, they got a lot of money to do this project, and they're saying, well, it wasn't enough, and then we chipped in another 2+ million.
Had we paid for all of the efficiency upgrades and the renewable storage on our own, it would far outweigh what we're currently paying. So the top cost of the grant plus another
Understand
4
that.
million.
But yeah, I figured out it would take 50 years for us to recoup the 2 million plus that we're putting into this.
It's not that.
It's like a 6-year payback, what we figured.
We calculate about 6
And
years.
that's at current Edison rates. If rates go up like they've been going up, the payback will be a lot shorter.
We pay what's about half our bill is based on our demand charge, which is our peak 15-minute of the whole month, and that can be quite high. And what storage will do is be able to smooth that out, so we could
We
be
should be
even
able
more
to avoid
savings.
demand charges, yes.
Yeah, so in the summer months, we have 3 demand charges, and like from 12 to 6 at the end of September, it ends this week, we pay $38 a kilowatt. There's a peak demand charge.
Wow.
It's not cheap. And we don't have any demand management in the building right now, so this is really gonna give us that capability.
And, we should be setting the example on things like this, not have a building that has 40-year-old technology in terms of energy efficiency.
Okay, so the next item, agenda item 4, is to essentially do 3 separate projects at the University of California, Irvine. They are looking at microgrid-based electricity systems and how different technologies would affect the emissions that come from that. So one is a stationary fuel cell and a microgrid, looking at the potential use at a refinery or refinery-like operations. The second is to look at natural gas or renewable natural gas injected into the natural gas pipeline on a microgrid and see how that might affect the burners and other downstream devices if you have a hydrogen injection into your fuel source. And the third is to look at a comparison between a fuel cell bus and the energy demands associated with fueling that bus compared to an electric powered bus. They have both of those buses in operation, so we'll actually have a good demonstration to compare those two. Funding for those projects are provided by the Southern California Gas Company, Department of Energy, the National Science Foundation. UCI is also putting in their own money, and they're asking us for a cost share of about 51%. That's typical of Department of Energy projects where they ask for 50% cost share. And so we're asked to be putting in about $660,000 for those 3 different projects. Any questions about item 4? Item 5 is the result of a targeted airshed grant that we applied for last year. We were notified this year that we were awarded. It's close to $5 million. They're split between 2 different projects. One is for replacing yard hostlers at both the Port of LA and Long Beach with electric yard hostlers. And the second project is to do commercial lawn and garden equipment replacement, where the commercial landscapers would have to scrap those older gas-powered equipment to get the battery-powered equipment that's offered through the program. And so this is to execute contracts with those entities at LA and Long Beach ports to replace the yard hostlers, and then to do a program announcement for the equipment from the commercial lawn and garden program.
How's the performance of the electric yard trucks?
From what we've seen in the early demonstrations, they've been able to satisfy the duty cycle. So the big concern originally had been, could they last a full shift? I think with the improvement in battery technology, they've shown that they can. BYD is the current kind of the leader in terms of the deploying technologies, but we're open to other vendors as well, but they seem to be the one that is the furthest along.
So these are BYD units?
I believe we're letting the fleet choose, so, but the ones that we've currently funded through Prop 1B have been BYD.
Okay, thanks.
Just a quick question, incidental question. Just kind of curious why you group these two items as one board item, since they're totally separate
They're both from the same,
topics.
they're both from the same funding source, so they're both the targeted airshed grants, so we're recognizing funds from the EPA,
Yeah,
and then we are then doing the two projects. So
Okay.
when we proposed to the EPA was two distinct projects, they awarded as one grant, so we're funding them accordingly.
okay.
Okay, so item 6 is to, this is a SEP agreement, so supplemental environmental projects. So both Region 9 EPA and ARB have come to regard the district as a go-to to implement air filters at schools. So whenever they come upon violations from entities and they agree on a supplemental environmental project, they come to us and say, would you administer the project for us? So this is just another in a string of probably a handful of steps that we've done with both EPA and ARB. This is another one to do at Walmart. We're getting funds from Walmart, and then from the EPA violation, and from ARB, it's with a small trucking firm, Morales Trucking, and that's for $27,000. But we'll be using our existing agreements with the school districts at Long Beach and LA to identify classrooms and environmental justice areas to do school filters. The other part of this is we had leftover funding from TRAPAC to do administration. So we were paying ourselves to administer the project. We did it so efficiently, there's actually money left over. So we're recommending that we put that money back into the TRAPAC agreement to buy replacement filters for the schools that were had filters installed as part of that program.
So what did Walmart, what did working firm do?
I think they had it was a truck that was in violation, so it was probably some of their fleet was not, they probably didn't have particular filters on certain model trucks.
Did Walmart identify the area that they wanted air filtration?
Other than it being an environmental justice area now.
Does our contract require schools only?
It does for these two projects, but understanding that Supervisor Rutherford is very interested in residential air filters, we have talked to ARB, and so they are going to their board, I think it's not this week, it's this month, to recommend other steps where they would allow air filters in residences.
So your administration costs or your reimbursement is $16,000 for administering the project? Is that what I'm reading at? $16,350?
Yes.
Does that actually reimburse you for administration costs, or is that just a portion?
We take a percent, so whatever that percent is.
Okay, all right, so that you,
Standard amount.
okay, thank you.
Wasn't there a Walmart SEP that recently came to the board from, it was either CARB or EPA that was just separate within the last year?
This is it.
Yeah, I'd have to check, Mark. Sounds familiar, but
But this is a separate and different one.
this is a separate and different new one that's coming forward.
With respect to the filters and replacement filters, is there anything going on to ensure that the many that the district has paid for installing get replaced and maintained, and any look at what the performance is after a period of time?
So for the first part of the question, yes, so that when we typically do these projects, there's a requirement for replacement filters up to a certain amount of time. So depending on how much money we were provided through the funding source, we would do filter replacements for 3 to 5 years. So we try to ensure that it's not a one-shot deal. The second part,
And we check that?
and we do check that. So one, I know there's been a recent incident where one of the school districts was concerned because the filters are more expensive. I think we have figured out a way to help offset some of those costs. So, it is an ongoing issue that we staff continues to monitor for each of the projects. And as long as you're replacing the filters, there is no, concern over the efficiency because you're taking out that pressure drop and putting new filters in.
Right, right. Is there any need as we're starting to do these projects with lots of filters for us to start building in, ensuring that we build into every one of them maintenance for a period of time?
We can, I mean, that's the board's decision. However, you would hope at some point the school district would recognize, or any of the recipients would recognize the benefit and build that into their budget as opposed to having the district do that. I mean,
Right.
we view ourselves as kind of a motivating initial kickstart, and then after that, we would hope that, and giving them a period of time to do filter replacements, that after that date, they would build it into their own budget.
Okay, thanks.
Item 7 is an easy one, where we came to the board recognizing Department of Energy funding to do electric school buses with vehicle to grid capability. At the time of the award, the proponent Bluebird had identified one company as a subcontractor, TransPower. They have since decided to use a different company, Efficient Drivetrain, but since it was acknowledged in the original board award, legal is making us come back to the board to say this is now going to EDI, Efficient Drivetrain. So it's just a simple matter of changing subcontractors. The 8th item, second to last of mine, is to recognize funding from NASA to do low-cost monitoring, and that helps to verify satellite data. So they've given us a modest amount of money, $75,000, to deploy low-cost PM sensors, and we would use that then to corroborate the satellite data, and the intent is to get final resolution with the satellite information that they have. So we're asking to recognize the funding and execute the program.
Satellites can measure 2.5? Satellites can do anything.
Well, they're looking to ensure that they can validate them.
My boss would like to be a citizen scientist. Of course.
I think your boss is a citizen scientist.
In this particular.
It depends on where they want to place them, because I know there's certain locations that they want.
You would like one anywhere, in the Wildemar area.
So noted. To ensure that.
Well, me too.
Ensure that Wildemar's taken under consideration.
He already does a little bit of that, so, yeah, with the newer technology.
The final one that I'll be presenting is to recognize funds for some of our laboratory capabilities. So as you know, with a massive effort in Paramount and Compton for Chrome-6 and metals air toxics, there's a need for us to increase our capability. We asked EPA Region 9 for funding, and they granted us to buy another ion chromatograph, so that's $75,000 that we're recognizing to purchase the piece of equipment. We're also asking to add monitors, so we're getting 33 more of those portable samplers that we would be able to deploy as part of the air toxics initiative. And then we're doing 3 separate projects, which will help us with our identifying of Chrome-6. As you probably know, it's a very intensive and time-intensive effort to measure Chrome-6 with these particle samplers. We're contracting with Aerodyne and Desert Research Institute. They have a near real-time capability on a mobile platform to identify both air toxics and Chrome-6. So the idea is you would use that as a survey instrument to go out to facilities and measure, again, near real-time, and whether there is a source that would be of concern. And then we would potentially put out some of our portable samplers. But this will help us identify in a very quick manner if there's an upstream source. The third project is with CSERT, UC Riverside. So we found in some of our source testing that we believe that refractory from some of these furnaces actually could be sourcing of Chrome-6. So we're going to look at CSERT to test different refractory materials to see if they're actually indeed sources of Chrome-6. And so that is item 9. The next 2 items Fred presents.
I'll take items 10 and 11. Item number 10 is to issue a program announcement for our last year of option 1B. We had about $137 million allocated to us, and for different categories, locomotives, cargo handling, and trucks. We were oversubscribed, but what happens, because especially on the truck side, a lot of these technologies, the zero emission ones especially, are not available yet. So some of the proponents fall through and decide not to move forward. So we have about $11 million left from the $137 million, we want to issue a program announcement in a manner that once we get enough trucks, we will close the program announcement. This is an agreement that we are doing with CARB to be in compliance with the requirements of the program. So we will get enough trucks, close the program announcement, and try to get into contracts with the qualified applicants. In case we have fall throughs again, then we are seeking authority to reissue the program announcement, so we won't lose a whole lot of time going through the board cycle, because we have to be in executed contracts by March of 2018. So this is just to seek authority to issue the program announcement. Any questions on this? Okay, and the next item, number 11, is our regular program announcement for replacing school buses owned and operated by public school districts and joint power authorities. The last program announcement we had is usually we do this every other year, because by the time we get applications in, we process them, get into grant agreements, and the buses are delivered. That's what it takes. So the last round is just completed. We have awarded 145 buses, and we are issuing a new one. We're going to be open until January, notifying all the schools to apply, and then we are anticipating to come back to the board in April with recommended funding amount and number of buses to be awarded. Any questions on this one?
Back to the previous item, are the zero and near zero emission trucks getting more available now for?
Yeah, we are anticipating the 12-liter .02 will be available in early 2018. So we then when applications come in, it will be more reasonable to think that they will continue and implement those projects.
So it'll be the super latest.
Yeah, we already have paid and implemented some of the 8.9 liters. They are on the road, but we are waiting for the 12 liters.
Cool.
And with the buses, you have an inventory now. There's a list of all of the schools primarily. You know which ones are the old ones. Do you target or say, hey, you have the oldest bus, let us give you money to buy a new one? I mean, is there any kind of...
We notify every school that has their own fleet that they own and operate. And then each school that applies, we ask them to replace their oldest buses first. But there are several factors we consider when we do the awards. Number one is we don't want a school like LA Unified to take over the entire amount of funding. So we distribute funds proportional to each county's population. The distribution is reasonable to the population. So if a school in, say, Riverside County applies, they are not competing with the funds that we want to allocate in LA County. Also, within LA County, we limit LA Unified to their proportion, so other schools in LA County can apply. Then we are also looking to EJ factors. But all these, depending on what applications we get in, we look at them, we evaluate, and then we propose our evaluation methodology to the board in the letter, and it's approved. One practice we have had is that every school that applies, they get at least one bus. So we don't want to discourage the school from not applying. But then getting more than that depends on the other factors.
Right. These private companies provide school bus to public schools. Do you know what percentage of the total school buses in our region are private?
It's approximately half.
And is there any program to help?
Well, throughout the years, we have helped private contractors with the retrofit part, particular matter retrofit. But what has happened is because we have replaced so many older buses that are owned by public school districts, we have replaced over 1,600. So when these schools those who are using private contractors, their boards respectively have required those contractors to have newer buses in order to get into contracts with them. So private contractors have used their own money to get newer buses.
But
When you say we've been oversubscribed in the past, and you're doing it by population within the counties, do you look at the number of buses and the average age of the buses? Because those are the ones that need the most replacement, or are there particular counties that get oversubscribed sooner than others?
No, usually, pre-1994 buses qualify for replacement. That's
Okay.
ARB's guidelines.
Right.
So if a school applies and say they don't have pre-87 buses, they just have, say, 1992 buses, we penalize them. We look at other factors also. But basically, any school that qualifies for funding, we encourage them to apply, and then as I said, we give them at least one bus. So some schools, it takes longer time to gradually replace their fleet. Other schools are more aggressive and they have older fleets, so it depends.
Any other questions for Fred? We're on page 7, item 12.
Okay,
Don?
good morning. This is a recommended action to issue a purchase order for Ingress database software licensing, maintenance, and support for 1 year. Ingress database is used by our class system. Basically supports all of our core activities, including permitting and inspection. And originally, we were looking for a 3-year agreement, but we're actually saving money by going for a 1-year purchase order. I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, next item is 13. I don't see Bayer, Marion.
No, so I'll try and take this one. This is basically to purchase 8 new toxic vapor analyzers. And there's really one manufacturer that we've been working with that we can do this for. And then they've offered us a substantial discount. It's almost 1/3 of the purchase price if we turn in the existing 8 units. So this will really help our inventory. We have over 24 of these now, but many of them are really old and falling apart. So this will help to supplement. And these analyzers, our inspectors can actually take out with them. They're relatively portable, and they're used to look at everything from refineries, landfill, oil and gas. Some of our complaint response, they use these as well. So they're really handy tools. So this is to buy 8 more and authorize us to turn back 8 to the manufacturer as a trade-in.
Okay. Item 14, MSRC. Anything of note there, Matt?
Nope.
Okay, on to page item 15.
This is a very straightforward item. The Brain and Lung Tumor Foundation, since its inception, has been expanding into other research areas, focusing on other health effects of air pollution. And a few years ago, the bylaws were amended to allow the foundation to conduct research into other areas other than brain and lung tumors. And this is to recognize that expanded role for the foundation by changing the name of the foundation to the Health Effects of Air Pollution Foundation.
This is funded by a percentage of fines above?
No, it's periodically the board will transfer penalty monies into the foundation, but there's no set.
It's not a formula?
No, there's
no
no formula.
a percentage of anything?
Just periodically monies are transferred over.
Other questions on that? So still on page 8, we have the reports. Any questions on 16 through 20? There was a robust discussion at Mobile Source Committee, item 20 in the AB 2766 program, and we got some good feedback to really use whatever powers we have to get the local jurisdictions to spend the money in a way that helps our AQMP goals and make sure they spend it quickly. So we're going to report back to Mobile Source in 6 months on some progress there.
Hasn't that always been the problem?
Huh?
Hasn't that always been the problem?
Always been a problem, but we'll try again. The MSRC has weighed in and now will allow matching funds from MSRC in this program. But the MSRC money is contingent on it really being AQMP goals, so that might leverage some of this funding into the right projects. And then the numbers that are presented in the report were completely biased by one LA City project that we need to go back and kind of check some of those numbers. So we'll report back in 6 months. Okay. Page 9, items. Anything on page 9? Anyone have any comments?
Is the rural forecast, so that's being set for the coming year now, every year it has to be up? Is that what this will be?
This is a monthly report.
Okay, that's just a monthly
In
one.
December, we'll have the
December
full
one.
year report.
Okay.
Just on the ARB, mentioned that they're going to consider residential air filters. They're meeting today, so the next meeting is end of October in Riverside. So will it be on the October agenda, do you think? Okay. It's in Riverside, so.
Okay, any other comments on the agenda? I think we've covered every item.
Just on item 22.
Yeah.
I would really like to express Vice Chairman White's, and certainly I read those, appreciation for the acceleration of the progress that is being made to the entire IT system and everything that's happening. And so I just want to express that that's been very,
That's right.
yeah, it's been great reading that milestone report every month. I do read that. So just want to say thank you very much.
Okay, so that completes the agenda, item 1 on our agenda. The next item we added at the request of this group on recent state legislation and impacts on our activities. My name's on here, and I could probably handle it, but I don't know if Derek wants to come in for the part of the discussion, and we have other staff here. But
So Rita, did you want to comment on the agenda or?
Oh.
On 1168, but I'm not sure if you're going to wait till the comment period to take comments on it.
you can, if you want to come, you can comment now.
Yeah, I think now.
We already discussed 1168, but you can comment on item 1.
Sorry, Derek. Good morning, Rita Liu, Director of Environmental Affairs for RATIC International. And we do have some concerns with 1168 that remain unaddressed. The main issues are the lack of clarity for the test method and the overly prescriptive record-keeping and reporting requirements in the rule for the suppliers. Now, I've heard staff say that this rule doesn't require any new record-keeping. That may be true for the end users because we do have Rule 109, and most recently we have Rule 219 that required yet another form from end users. But this rule is going to apply to suppliers. So now you're impacting 2 links in the supply chain and potentially more depending on how one looks at the rule. So we don't think that for these types of materials that are the solution to the problem, which basically they're very low VOC, we don't think it makes sense to have this duplicative record keeping and now impact suppliers that are not located in California. Most of our raw material suppliers and formulators are not in the state, but if they're selling into Southern California, they would be impacted by these requirements. And we just think that's going to be a disincentive in bringing the products in. I mean, people are going to glue the product somewhere else and then figure out a way to get it into Southern California. Rather than go through this exercise, which really does not benefit air quality. One of our concerns is the medical device industry. The way the rule defines an adhesive is basically anything that bonds one surface to another. So while medical device manufacturing is exempted from the VOC requirements of the rule, it is not exempted from section F1 and F2, which is the record keeping, labeling, and reporting requirement. And we really don't need an exemption from the VOC limits. We don't, because we're super compliant. So you have limits at 500 in some categories, 250 in other categories. We're less than 50. So that exemption is pretty much meaningless to us because we're already there. So their devices, and I emailed, an article of adhesives that are light cured adhesives that go inside the body, that are used for surgery, that are used for wound healing, for heart procedures. There's one really neat application where it's a biodegradable LED adhesive that goes in heart tissue and is used to bind the surface of the heart so you don't have to do an invasive procedure. And then once it figures out that the tissue has healed, it disintegrates in the body because it's biodegradable. I mean, there is so much innovation in this industry, but rules like this, where it's basically all about the paper, now these companies are having to divert their people from doing R&D, which is what they're good at, to doing administrative functions. And Rule 314 has not been a good model for the industry. I know the American Coatings Association has sent in written comments expressing their concerns over the record-keeping requirements of this rule. And lastly, the other issue I had was the test method. There is no equity in this rule. Some technologies are getting a method specified and some are not. The rule says for some technologies this method may be used, and in some other categories this method shall be used. And we don't know what the difference is between a may and a shall. We have a may right now, and we want to be a shall. But we don't know what we have to do to get to that. We think we've done enough, and the district doesn't have a better method. So why not specify our record in the rule as a shall so that we have that certainty? One of our manufacturers reported that if they had to do a different test method, if they had to rerun the test with a different method, it would cost their company $9 million to retest every product. So we hope that these issues can be worked out. So far, they haven't. And right now, we're in oppose on the rule. Thank you.
Any questions?
I do have one. You indicated that earlier when I asked about it, that you had changed some of the language in the rule and made very specific in the resolution about addressing one part of that.
Right.
And has Rita seen that?
I don't believe so, not until tomorrow, and the package will be out.
Okay.
So hopefully that resolves some of the issues. I don't think we're going to resolve all of RadTech's issues.
Right.
But,
Right.
I'm happy to answer questions on some of the things she brought up if anyone's interested.
Hopefully she'll have a pleasant surprise in the morning.
Hopefully.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Well, I do, on the guidance document, is it more of an, per product, it is then you shall use this test method, or is it either or? Here's one, and if you use that one, we're not gonna make you go back.
It's never meant to be either or, but Heather, you want to address how, in particular, ASTM method 7767, the issues with that.
Yes. So that particular method, our lab, you basically have to take the raw materials that went into creating that final product and test the raw materials. So with our inspection staff out in the field, they're going to pick up that completed product. They're going to go back and get component A and component B and mix them together and have any reasonable certainty that that reflects what that sample is that's collected in the field.
So at this point, the best method we have for those types of products really can't be used as an enforcement tool unless we had the full formulation. But that's why, each of these methods, the language shall or may is addressed because each of these methods have different issues, and we would need to leave it open to other methods that may be better. And the intent is never this double jeopardy, as I said earlier, that there's an either or. You fail one, you have to test both to see if you but use two methods, and if you fail either one of them, it's not compliant. It's just that at this time, you don't necessarily know for every product which method is best. So this guidance document will help lay out, if you have this type of product, then this is the method you test by, this is the method we'll enforce by, assuming we can even enforce, because some methods we can't. It's just for labeling purposes at this point.
So the guidance document is intended to provide certainty,
Yeah.
which is certainly something that business wants.
Yes,
Right,
absolutely.
and then we'll be taking the guidance document to the board, so you guys.
Oh, yeah.
Get an eye.
Yeah, no, I heard that discussion.
And with respect to UVEB, there's a method that the industry is saying that should be used, and then the other method that they're concerned that they'll be held to, my understanding is that that method is specifically says it can't be used for UVEB.
Yes.
Yes, so, yeah.
Okay, so at least in terms of the district's view, that it's just completely not applicable for enforcement purposes to
And we
that.
added a statement in the rule to specify that too, that we wouldn't use the test method. The test method itself says it's not applicable to that product.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, any other questions on that? Okay, so any other comments on item 1 on the agenda? So we're back to item 2.
Start off with that, turn it over. So this year, we had what we consider one of probably the most successful legislative sessions in Sacramento. We had a bill, AB 1132 by Christina Garcia, that gives the executive officer the authority to issue imminent substantial endangerment and to temporarily shut down businesses until a hearing board hearing is heard. That is creating a substantial endangerment to communities. The other bill that is currently on the governor's desk, AB 1274, and that's our smog abatement fee bill. And I call it the Fred Manassian Act because it was Fred's idea to come up with this. But it's delaying when cars that are 6 years old get a smog check. So it delays it from year 6 to year 8. And in lieu of that, the owners of the vehicles pay a $25 a year fee. And that goes, $21 is going to go to us, to the air pollution control districts. And then the $4 is going to go to BAR, Bureau of Automotive Repair. And that is because BAR said they were going to be losing finances. So they asked for this $4 fee to be sent over to them, and we agreed to that. That bill, is, like I mentioned earlier, is on the governor's desk. He has until October 15th to sign the bill. We haven't heard any opposition from the governor's office to the bill, but it remains to be seen what he's going to do. We're hopeful. We feel it's a good bill. The other two.
Sorry, Jack, if he doesn't sign, it becomes law.
And if he doesn't sign, it becomes law automatically, right?
Yeah, no action.
So.
I think it'd be good to tell them how much this is helping our car and motor program.
Sure. So it's anywhere from an additional.
About $35 million a year.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which
in
is
addition to what you get.
pretty substantial.
And it has no sunset date.
Yeah, there is no sunset date, exactly. And then, which is key because the next items I'm going to talk about, it's only funding guaranteed for 1 year and then we have to go back. But those are budget trailer bills to AB 617 and AB 398, AB 109, which is a trailer bill to AB 617. And that is monies that are going to be used for the mandates that 617 created on the districts to do community monitoring. So there's monies in there for that, about $27 million statewide, of which 11 million is going to go to, 11 million additional is going to go to ARB. The other one is
In
AB.
addition to the 27.
In addition to the-
27 for districts, 11
for
12
car.
million for car for AB 617, which I can talk about.
And then AB 134, which is the trailer bill for AB 398, which is a significant amount of money that's going to be coming to our district. But it's going to go to the 3 major districts, us, Bay Area, and San Joaquin, and the smaller districts are going to get a
small amount of money, but this is gonna be about $107.5 million we're gonna get pretty soon, probably next month or two, and that is gonna go to Carl Moyer programs.
That's a
to fund
once?
those. So once, it's only allocated for this 1 year, but it's gonna be part of the governor's budget in the following years, but again, it's not permanently allocated like AB 1274 is just a continuous allocation. We're gonna have to go back every year and show how successful the programs have been. There's gonna be a significant target on our backs for this money because a lot of other folks are gonna want this money. It's GGRF monies that is available, and it's also dependent on what the sale of the pollution credits are, like the cap and trade credits. Will be dependent on how much money we get. And I'll turn it over to Phil. He's got a couple other bills that he wants to talk about.
Sure, and just AB 398 was the one that extended the cap and trade program to 2030. That kind of solidified the cap and trade auctions and the revenue that would be generated. So there was a total of $1.5 billion basically on the table for greenhouse gas reduction fund monies, and that's what every year we'll have to go and fight for, as we did this year. So as Derek was talking about earlier, that portion, there was one bill, the AB 134, that was giving out $900 million. $250 million of that was for the Carl Moyer statewide, and so we got $107.5 million based on our 43% population. So it was kind of an agreement amongst CAPCOA. So that's the portion that we would get. But there are also $100 million for the EFMP program, 140 for the CVRP. So lots of incentives for the smaller light duty vehicle type things. Also HVIP, or basically hybrid or electric, larger heavy duty vehicles, things like that. There's $180 million going to that. $140 million for freight equipment and advanced demonstration pilot commercial deployment program. Also $85 million for agricultural sector emissions. So a lot of that is grant based. We need to go and apply for it. So it's kind of hard to determine exactly how much we'll get, but we'll definitely be aggressive in trying to get more of that money. Basically, also there's one bill that wasn't mentioned that's right now the governor has until October 15th to still sign bills. So there's a couple pending. There's our bill 1274 that's still pending. AB 1647 is relating to basically community monitoring, fence line monitoring with refineries. That's going to go in. Basically, it's very similar to our Rule 1180. That's still in progress and going through its rulemaking. So that particular bill basically has a situation where it's requiring by the year 2020 for community monitoring to be put in, designed, and installed and maintained by air districts, local air districts, and then fence line monitoring to be basically put in by the facilities. Now this all is supposed to be paid for by the facilities. So in terms of funding, that is supposed to be covered. But that bill is still on the governor's desk also, so it may or may not be put into law. So we'll have to take that into account.
And how does that affect 1180?
Well, luckily it conforms pretty well. The timelines we were looking at 1180 were pretty close to what this bill would require if it's signed. They have like January 1st, 2020. We were looking at about a 2-year time frame anyway, so this is not that different, maybe a little bit faster than we had anticipated in our rule. Our rule had an option for whether, on the community monitoring side, whether the refinery would conduct it or enter into a cost recoverable agreement with the district to do it. This essentially trumps that and requires the district to do it, but it also specifically says that the refineries will have to fund it. So it's the version of the bill that got through the legislature is much improved from some of the previous versions, and we helped with that through the process in terms of timing. And but it works pretty well with our rule. We had a working group meeting last week that there seems to be broad support for our rule generally. Obviously, communities have concerns about refineries and everything, so we heard a lot of comments about that. But the provisions of the rule and conforming with this potential state law is going pretty well. We'll be ready for December.
And if it doesn't, if he vetoes it, it's on his desk, or if he vetoes it, that doesn't have any impact on 1180. In fact, most of what's in 1180 is already embedded in. It's kind of the two-prong approach. So
Yeah, well, if he vetoed it, staff would still move forward with bringing 1180 to the board. We are making changes to 1180 now in anticipation of the governor signing it. If he doesn't, or if he vetoes it, we may have to go back and change some things back, but we need to make it align. So I think we'd still have time. We'll know by mid-October. We'll still have time to get to the board in December, one way or the other.
And it's December's timeframe, 11/8, that's when the board is going to act on 11/80.
December.
Yeah.
And the last bill I would just mention is one from before, which was SB1, which had just had some impacts on the district in terms of kind of locking in the current truck and bus rule. There's limitations on how much future amendments can be made for quite a while. There's also enforcement of that rule. Now the heavy-duty vehicles have to be registered with the DMV, so that's better enforcement. And there's also a $50 million in terms of a zero and near zero emission warehouse program funding that's going to be workshopped by CARB in terms of how it's allocated.
But those are that's going to be grant also.
Yeah, it's grant. So I could talk a little bit more about impacts to the district of AB 617. AB 617, as Philip mentioned, is kind of the companion bill to 398 that dealt with air quality, not GHG, but more specifically community air quality impacts. And so there's essentially 4 elements that of that rule that will be additional workload for the district. One is relatively small. There's a requirement for a uniform system of statewide emission reporting, and we will have to be involved with CARB in setting that up, and maybe some small changes, hopefully they're small, to our emission reporting protocols, if they are going to be uniform statewide, some software work that needs to be done to interface with every statewide system CARB comes up with. We already report annual emissions to CARB. Some other districts do it every 3 years, so they have more, this was more applicable to them because this now says annual. Another issue is, there were, in 617, there are BART requirements, largely put in there because of our reclaim program. I don't think it's going out on a limb to say that. So there is some timeline for implementing BART in that legislation, and so it does kind of light a fire under our reclaim sunset efforts. There are some flexibilities in the state law, but we are working to show as much progress as we can towards the transition, and we'll be working on reclaim, Reg 20 amendments for reclaim, but we're very close to kicking off a whole series of BART rules.
I have kind of a side question, but it relates to this. What is the incentive to reclaim facilities to stay in the reclaim program when they know it's going to be? Why don't they just opt out?
Well, they can't right now.
They
so
can't?
one of the
Except power plants.
except power. Well, there's another opt-out that's more difficult that no one has ever taken. But part of what we're doing in some shorter-term amendments, hopefully first quarter of next year with reclaim, is to make sure no one else comes in, to make it easier to get out, and then potentially just remove some facilities that already have other rules and just provide time. We've met with a lot of facilities that I've already said, like, just get us out one way or the other, and just tell us. We'll put on the BART, just tell us what it is and give us time and we're fine. So we need to do some short term on kind of the medium to small facilities. And then on the larger facilities, what really needs to be done is rulemaking for refineries, power plants, and larger facilities. And we're working on that schedule now, and we'll be putting that on the rule forecast report in December, and maybe even before then kicking off some working groups. So under AB 617, we figured to sunset reclaim, we had, 3 or 4 years maybe to go through a bunch of rulemakings. It's, depending on how you want to interpret it, in a strict interpretation, you could say it's really 16 months we need to get all this in order. So that's a workload issue. The 27 million statewide, which we hope to get a good fraction of that, if not close to half of it, to implement, will allow us to hire new staff and to put a lot of efforts into our rulemaking over the next year, and make as much progress as we possibly can towards those statutory deadlines. But the two more probably longer term workload and change in the way we do things components of AB 617 are monitoring, community monitoring, and these community emission reduction plans. So the legislation requires CARB to come up with statewide guidance and to identify priority communities for air monitoring. and the districts are required to do that monitoring. And, we have 1 year of funding, on the maybe 11 to $13 million range, depending how that gets allocated, but that'll have to go towards setting up monitoring networks in the identified communities, which we don't know where they are yet, and we don't know
How many,
and we don't know what kind of monitoring is going to be required, but we're working very closely with CARB. We obviously have a lot of experience in this area and probably have more experience than CARB, so we're hoping they listen to us when they are going through this process and setting up these statewide guidelines. And there will be a full public process both at the state level and at the local level as these things get worked out. And then maybe in some or all of those communities that are getting monitoring, there's also requirements for a community emission reduction plan, which will essentially looks like it's going to be like a mini community AQMP with all the measures that could be taken in that community to reduce emissions, reduce toxic risk. And that's obviously, AQMP is a very time-consuming process, and depending what that state guidance looks like, developing these kind of mini plans could be just as time-consuming and a lot of outreach, obviously, with the communities. So we're trying to estimate those resource impacts, how many people we need, the timing of when we need the people, working with CARB. There's a call every week with CARB on implementation of AB 617. There's a monthly face-to-face meeting of some of the larger districts and with at the EO level. So the main things are getting as much money as we can, getting as quickly as we can so we can get started on all these things. So that's what we're working on now.
And I just want to add too, so it really is going to impact a lot of fill shop because of the planning for these community reduction plans and the rule writing for the BART. But it also is going to really affect our monitoring and analysis folks, because depending on what community you pick, there may be some that we can use PM 2.5 low-cost sensors for. That'll be fairly less expensive for at least the hardware, but still a lot of resources. And if it's a Paramount or a Compton, it's going to be this intensive chrome monitoring. So it affects them. Part of the plans also are going to be to direct incentive funding. So it also is going to affect, Carl Moyer and other type programs. So we're trying to get a handle on what this actually is going to mean. And the expectation for a lot of these communities is once you go in, you never leave. So if you do 2 or 3 communities a year, and every year you add 2 or 3 more, this could completely blow up. So we're trying to set up expectations that when you do this, maybe it's a 2 to 5 year monitoring and reduction program, and then you can say that one is closed off and you move. So this is really a huge piece of legislation. They're calling it a landmark change. And we're hoping we can leverage a lot of what we're already doing. Maybe we can get credit for Paramount and Toxic and Compton for our first 2 communities, but we're going to end up putting something together to come to the board probably in November or December when we get a little bit more definition on this, and then we'll definitely have to staff up.
And in terms of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Community, so I think of that in terms of planning. You have the general plan as your sort of foundation, and then you have all these community plans that is there going to be any kind of definition as to what a community is? Because you can drill down to, a couple of blocks versus a community might be some cities. Is there any guidance on how they're?
Not yet.
Not yet. And so the Bay Area has a similar program to our MATES, and theirs is called the CARE program. And they have actually gone a step further and looked at not only that toxic and other pollution monitoring data, they've linked that up with some health-related data, and they have 12 CARE communities that they've been trying to identify and work through and direct funding and do other things as well. So they have already predefined what they have as a community, and it's sort of sections of cities, and some are larger or smaller. So I think, like what Phil said, we're trying to influence the way the decisions get made so that makes sense for us. And it may be cities or portions of cities, or it could be another, but it's very squishy right now. There's no definitions.
So what you're really trying to do is you're trying to manage the two. You still have the macro, but now you're getting down to the micro. So
right.
and because we have the criteria, the EPA, that you have all of those problems, we still have to have the infrastructure for the macro. But really, the law is now micro. you're getting down to.
In
the
addition to
micro.
macro, so it's not like any of our
Right.
old responsibilities have gone away, we're just getting new ones. So, for instance, CARB, in their budget got 50 new full-time equivalent employees and
22 temporary.
22 temporary employees to
full-time.
implement this. They created an entire new division and reshuffled staff already to implement this. The districts are gonna have to do something similar. We're gonna have to have a new department group, whatever you wanna call it, to do some of this long-term. Matt's staff may have to double, special monitoring staff or more, right? We might need a new lab and.
And if you're required to do that, it's like the same problem SCAG runs into is when it starts doing some of its housing allocations or RENA numbers. You have communities that say, no, I don't want this. So your PR part of you might have overlap because you're looking at an airshed, not.
I suspect we may have more communities saying, add us, we want to be, then.
But we're not like them. We want to be, and so trying to tell them, yes, you are. When you look at this, we're going to put Mead Valley over Temescal, and they think they're completely different. But in that piece of it, they're.
You may have some community groups in the same community who want it, and others in the same community who don't want it.
Oh yeah.
And that's what happened in Paramount. The city council got very sensitive about it, and they got very involved in it actually. But then there's, like Phil said, community groups that wanted us to go ahead.
Oh sure.
They don't want us giving bad news, but it is what it is. You can't hide it.
We want to make sure this doesn't take away from our air toxics initiative.
Right.
We started in Paramount and Compton because the main focus seems to be PM 2.5 for this effort, the sort of the impetus behind it. So we're going to try and see what we can do to strategize and get this lined up with what we need to do.
There's some environmental justice groups who have had it with monitoring that we offer and they don't want it. They say, we know what the problem is, just solve the problem. So there might be some areas that don't have any monitoring but actually have a community emission reduction plan. There might be other communities that have monitoring, but maybe you don't find much, so they don't need a community emission reduction plan. So there's going to be overlap, obviously, and you want to show progress and track progress, but there may be some, they may not line up exactly. And it's all, by statute, a public process. The decisions that CARB has to come to are all going to be workshopped, and we're trying to push that their process includes the districts making recommendations to them, and if we're going to do that, then we need a public process here to develop those recommendations. So it's not all worked out yet, but.
So there are timelines already established
for the monitoring?
For the community, well, I think the community emission reduction plans are going to be your most.
Though I think the timing on that is less, I don't have the bill in front of me. 2020s, yeah.
And that is focused primarily on PM?
No.
Well, that's kind of the driver behind the people that put together this legislation, but it's open for whatever the community would need. So some communities.
Criteria, some toxics.
Chrome, some could be diesel. We know that most of these areas.
PM 2.5 is not the issue.
Yeah,
and
diesel.
just because some of the people who had influence in how this legislation was written are still saying it, just use low cost PM 2.5. We're not going to go in a community and pretend like everything's okay if PM 2.5 is okay when we know there's other things that are more important. So we're going to do it right regardless. But we're hoping that CARB's guidance is in line with what we think we need to do. I mean, the goals here are great. We were in support of 617 in terms of all the goals and the changes to the way air quality is addressed in these communities. It's just we ended up opposing just because it was zero funding. We got promised funding, and then the funding actually did come through. So, we just need to make sure it gets implemented right.
And so how much funding are we getting?
27 million.
Statewide.
So
For 1 year.
Probably 11 or so.
Is there a formula?
And it's
Not
just
yet.
1 year.
1 year?
Yeah.
Only?
But we hope it
It'll
comes
go
every
away
year.
after a year. It'll be done.
If we could show, the main thing is if we get this funding, we need to spend it, we need to show progress. So next year when we ask for it, it's like, look what you got for your money. And we don't have a lot of time because next year's budget starts probably before we're going to
January.
So it could start before we even get the money, or are able to open new positions and get the people in that are going to be doing this work or buy the equipment that's needed. So timing is just critical on this.
Yeah.
And there's been no allocation statewide yet. I think Capco is gonna talk about it Monday.
Merry Christmas.
But CARB has 72 new people that are starting to, okay.
It looks like they're getting more people than all the districts could get put together, and don't ask me why. If you read the language
It's kind
of
of like
what,
Bar stole money from us because
if you read the language of what they're required to do versus what districts are required to do, it's pretty clear that they're gonna have lots of oversight and guidance development, but when it comes to actually doing the work, it's all us, so.
Are there enough engineers and technical folks out there? You have a stack of resumes in your
I've been
office?
talking to people in that other room since I'm looking for a job. Yeah,
I know you guys are
we
a
know, that's a
popular
big
hire.
concern. It's not just us. It's CARB and Bay Area and San Joaquin are all gonna be hiring at the same time, looking for the same people.
Oh, and you're gonna have local jurisdictions needing to
Region
hire in order to review and comment and be part of this.
So we'll probably end up taking some of our senior experienced staff and reassigning them to this and then backfilling some of the other positions. And we're still being in the fortunate position that if we have openings for inspectors, we get hundreds of applications, or engineers, or not so much for the air quality specialists, because that's a little bit more tailored to needs, but we're still seeing lots of qualified applicants and coming up with lists of wonderful candidates. So at least for now, it looks like we're okay, but when all these other people start hiring, it may get a little bit more competitive.
I was talking to some of the EPA people who are here for the conference, and
Yeah, that's a
there's
good
lots
place
of
to drop in.
a few disgruntled
I just
EPA
said
employees.
you're gonna get a lot of EPA people, I think.
Maybe you should just leave a stack of applications out there.
I have them ready, I would.
Living
breakout session.
Yeah, have a 4-day work week, that's a huge draw, the
Yeah.
4-day work week.
There's some CARB staff in El Monte who aren't so excited about driving to Riverside.
Yeah, I'm just afraid that there's some of our employees from that area that might think it would be cut their commute in half to go to Riverside, so there's gonna be some trading around probably.
So on a different, I'm just on a slightly different subject though, with, you know, said we got the biggest take ever, the biggest successful thing that we've had.
legislatively,
Legislatively.
as I was reminded by Matt.
Potentially overall.
But as it relates to the AQMP, you know, during the AQMP process, they talked about, you know, we need potentially $1 billion a year to, as far as to fund or finance the objectives of the AQMP. How close did we get? What's the number now?
Well, we don't know because of the competitive grant portion, which is a big portion of this, but just already in-house, we have, let's just assume this happens every
Right,
year, which we have no guarantee, but let's just say it gets carried over more or less. So we have ongoing 70 million in Carl Moyer or so. We have 107 million from this legislation. There's another, what is
24 million.
24 million.
923.
AB 923.
And then the grants.
And then the grants, you know, if it's 140 million statewide for freight, advanced freight technologies, I mean, typically 80-90% of that comes to us.
So we're close to 30%.
Probably
33%.
going to be
200 or 300.
Yeah.
We might be at 300 or 400 million.
But this
Just
is
from the legislative session.
this is just the first
No,
go
I
around.
understand.
And we're still going to DC. We're trying to get money out of DC.
Right.
We're still going to try to get money at the state level, and
So there's still other container fees are being discussed.
Right,
There's
no,
lots
that's
of
why
other-
I'm just saying how close did we get, so we've got a good chunk going to try to cover that.
If we could, and the best thing is if we can show this really makes a difference, then you have
Right.
leverage to ask for more.
Well, on 1274, is that, I'm sorry, when you said back to the districts, is that all the AQMDs, or is that,
Yes.
was that,
It's Moyer.
so it's Moyer?
It's Moyer and then that distributed by formula. But we get
Distributed by
40% of that. So we're still.
We get 40%, you said?
Or
43.
43%.
We're gonna double the Moyer program.
Okay. All right.
So we're gonna need more people to deal with contracts and
But we get admin fees from that, so we don't.
6.25.
But there's a lot of new work that would otherwise be unfunded, so the 27 million statewide is gonna allow us, I think, to expand and take care of some of this work. We just don't know how much we're getting at.
Sounds like you guys really gelled this year in the legislature. I mean, that's really.
it was both rewarding but also very tiring too. A lot of trips and a lot of negotiating, and you know, you go through the ups and downs of negotiations. But overall, I felt really good on the 15th of September.
Well, I was about to give you all the credit, but then I realized
No, it's everybody.
that it's like
It's everybody.
it's like everybody just kind of worked together.
The Fred Manassian Act is, that was worth a good chunk of money.
We might want to change the name of the fund.
I agree.
We'll call it the Moyer Manassium program.
I think Wayne and Barbara Baird would be added to that list of
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
that really did an awful lot on this. Yeah, but.
I was there too, but you know.
I said everybody.
No, Phil was
I think one of the most important things is I think when we started this effort towards the beginning of the year, when you talk to the members and their staff, like their opinion of the agency at that time versus what it is now.
Yeah, now. Oh, yeah.
Huge change.
And I've gotten that, and I've heard that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'll say a lot of it has to do with Wayne, to be honest with you. I think. You know, he's done some good stuff, and he's got that personality that gets along with people, and that's kind of half the battle right there. But I'll tell you, I've gotten feedback from staff, for the elected offices, and we are so responsive to their questions.
Must be contract negotiation time for you.
No, it's not. We don't have contracts. We're at will, so it doesn't matter. Yeah.
We keep our job for a couple more months.
Yeah, but they say that we have been very responsive, and we respond very quickly. So I think has a lot to do with our credibility also.
You're buying Christmas cards for the flight attendants on Southwest. You know all their kids' names by now?
Yeah. They've heard my complaints about mine, so.
So any other questions on state legislation?
This was very helpful, thank you.
And we'll be soon talking about next year's priorities at Ledge Committee, right?
Money, money, money.
I will say that the same LA Times editorial board, I'm assuming it's the same people who said we were delusional to think that we could raise money for incentives to clean the air under the AQMP, wrote an editorial saying 900 million is nowhere near enough. We should be getting more. So it just takes time for people to kind of come around and understand.
I know.
Yeah, sorry. So other business? Anything else you guys want to see before this group in coming meetings? None comments, and then public comment. Nothing else. Okay. Thank you, everyone.